Okay, Aquaba, and welcome back again. We are in part 3 of looking at enslaved colonial artists. And so we are going to look at Harriet Powers, who was known to be a quilter. She did a lot of hand stitch work. She did a lot of applique hand stitch work. And that's what she was known for. Like the women in G's Bend, probably known for their standard quilting processes where they're doing rectangular or block shapes. And Harriet Powers had a whole different way of working. Her work was more narrative. This is the best image thus far that I've been able to find of Miss Powers. Miss Powers more than likely is wearing an apron that she did in fact create. And so let's go ahead and look at one of her most popular quilts. This particular artist, as well as David Drake, they're in African American art, so you would want to read further to get more information. You also want to read up on Harriet Powers to get more information about her in African American art by Patton. But let's talk about this one. This one, as far as I know, is in the Smithsonian. And it is one of her most famous ones, called simply Bible Quilt. And so looking at this one, you can see that it is narrative, telling many stories that are right out of the Bible. Some of them you can tell right away what they are. Some of them you have to look for a minute, then kind of figure it out. And but spend as much time looking at that. Also, again, don't forget to read up in African American art about Harriet Powers and about this particular quilt called Bible Quilt. And notice the blocking process that has happened here as she has created her work. I think this is, yeah. So the ones that I pointed out here, excuse me with the nose itch, but the ones I've pointed out here are these particular symbols that I'll talk a little bit more about when I show you the examples of Harriet Powers. More than likely, she was working with cotton and working with various either scraps that she was given or scraps that she acquired over a period of time, because she was one of the main seamsters. So depending on the size of plantation that she was on or the farm that she was on, because really plantations were farms, right? So depending on the size of it, she may have made everything that was especially in the larger plantations. The slaves pretty much made everything, including a lot of times the house that the person lived in themselves, that the owner lived in. And of course, their own dwellings. A lot of times they built their own dwellings. And so that's why if there are any slave dwellings that are left, and you're lucky enough to still observe them, and they've been preserved, you will see that they have a very African feel in terms of how they were built, because what are people going to do? Again, they bring their cultural sensibilities with them in their cultural suitcases, so they're going to build what feels like home, and that would make sense. Okay, so let's look further at Harriet Powers' work. I'm going to stop this share, or new share. Let's see if I can get a new share. There we go. That's perfect. And then here we are with this, and then we're going to share this. Okay, so let's make this large on the screen right quick. Okay, so this is from that one in the upper left. Now, remember we talked a lot when we were looking at Flash of the Spirit about 4 moments of the sun, representing the 4 major processes in life: birth, high noon representing youth, and then dusk or evening representing middle age, and then sunset representing transition. We would think of it as death, but in traditional African society, it's transition. So you're moving out of one space. And then also it's cyclical, it cycles back. So transition is really next to the, if it's going to repeat, which it does, especially from the African tradition and perspective. Once transition happens, you're still going back to the birth space. And so she appeared to be extremely familiar with that process. This particular design feels a lot like Dahomey. It feels a lot like certain designs that I have seen in pottery that are much older than Harriet Powers and her work. And so I really do feel like a certain African sensibility, and even the way that she creates the figures, it feels very much like Dahomey or people from that region. All of it doesn't have to be Dahomey. Let me see. And so what would happen with applique is just like the word sounds. The root is apply. You apply fabric to the surface, or you apply fabric underneath the surface. Like it looks like this particular striped not triangle, I'm sorry, striped diamond was applied to the back. This diamond was cut out of the white, and then the backing of this striped coloration of this diamond was applied to the back, and then it was stitched down from the top. That's what it looked like happened to me. Okay, now let's look at some more examples. This is the overall, so that was coming from this particular design, okay? And then this is the one I think we're going to deal with next. There's a lot that's going on here, but I'm trying to get through this. Take your time to go back and look at it in the book or here in the video if you want. And so the open hand, the open raised hand, feels like something that is done traditionally, especially if you go to African-American churches. You're going to see people raising their hand to feel the spirit from on high, so to speak, coming down to them. And so the open raised hand is like, you know, feeling the spirit. This eye, I feel, is a protective eye, not like the Illuminati and what they got going on, but like a protective eye, in the eye of the creator, okay? Again, notice the importance of the sun. She does a lot of suns in her work. Again, this one has a sun too. This one is, and that's where this hand is and this eye. And this would make sense because this is the Adam and Eve scene. So, you know, if you read the story, you know that God was watching what was going on with Adam and Eve. So the all-seeing eye of God kind of thing. And then this is the snake. Now, what I love that she has done that I have not seen a lot of artists do this period is that she has taken the time to give the snake feet. If you read in the Bible that passage about this, one of the things that the snake was cursed with after all of this stuff happened in the Garden of Eve is that was cursed to crawl on his belly forever. And so if he was cursed to crawl on his belly, there's an indication or implication that it must have had feet. And so I love the fact that Harriet Powers used her imagination and decided to give the snake, even though it's like little bird feet, it's okay. She gave the snake feet because this is prior to the fall, you know, from the biblical sense of Adam and Eve. And so those are some elements that I wanted to point out to you. Let me see what's happening here. Did I show you all? It looks like I may have shown you everything. Yeah, there's that. There's that. Yeah, so I think that was it. But check out the way these people are done. These people are done in such a traditional Dahomey way. It's kind of abstract, but not really. It almost has that sort of to help people relate, that Matisse kind of sense. But she did hers way prior to French Matisse, who came about much later. And a lot of these European artists, especially the so-called modern artists of the 20th century, the early 20th century, late 19th century, they were looking at traditional African art because of what was happening with the raiding of the art and the colonialism and all of that. So all of that made them have encounters with the artwork. Okay, so that is Harriet Powers. Please read about her in your book. I think you will be pleasantly surprised at all of the amazing things that she did. Okay, so right now I am going to stop the share with that, or maybe get a new share. Let's get a new share. I think I need to go back to the, here, back here. Let me see. Robert S. Duncanson. Yeah. Now this video clip you can watch because they do give you some interesting things about what was happening with him during the particular period that he was an artist. His situation was unusual. I'm still not sure. I haven't been able to find it yet on Robert S. Duncanson as to whether or not his father was white. I kind of think he was, but I'm not sure. And that perhaps he, or maybe his mom was white, but I don't know. A lot of times it was hard for white women to hold on to their Black children. Maybe he was given up for adoption. I don't know. Who knows the story? But he was a practicing artist during the period of slavery. A practicing artist during the period of slavery. Based on his look, my guess is that he may have been able to pass a few times if he had on a hat and you didn't see all the curls. That's my guess, you know, and then so maybe he was able to get work without people fully understanding all that he was. And if he mastered the standard way of speaking at the time, he may have been able to kind of slide through and by. Until people, of course, found out who he was. But he was able to do it. He was able to do it. And so read about him in your book. One of the things that he worked with a lot, he was a photographer. So he worked with the camera. He also was an oil painter. He was known for his oil paintings. And sometimes he did some of the oil paint on canvas. Sometimes he did some of the oil painting as murals. Let me think of what would be an example now. Kind of like, yeah, it's kind of like that, but I'm trying to bring it up to 21st century so that you can get a sense of what it would be like. Accent wall is the only way I can think to kind of coin it, but it was a little bit more than an accent wall because this took a lot longer to do than an accent wall. Usually he had wealthy clients. Typically they had a really large house and they wanted a mural painted onto the wall, usually of some landscape, because that's what he was mostly known for, was his landscape paintings. In your book, African American Art, when you're reading up on Robert Duncanson, please read about what school was popular at the time. There was a certain school that was about painting the landscape. I think they might talk about it in the video link too. And now he wasn't trained with that particular school, but because that school was putting the sort of popular landscape out, which was about American stuff, but again, you know what the name of the school is or what, you know, what they called it. But because that was popular, he understood. He was a businessman, so he understood that, hey, I'm going to get in on this too. Maybe I wasn't trained at that particular school, but I know how to do this. And I know how to utilize photography and also then to translate that into creating these beautiful landscapes. So what he was really good at doing was creating a sense of realism in his landscapes. He knew how to blend out his oils very well. This almost looks like a photograph. It's so well done. And that's another reason why I wanted to point out to you that he utilized the camera. So I think that he was going around in America capturing various landscapes with the camera, and then going back to his studio. And then, oh, sorry, we're not going to get to Patrick in this particular section, but, and then going back and making sure that he replicated that. This particular title is quite funny: Blue Hole, Floodwater, Little Miami River. Blue Hole, just like it looks, floodwaters, Little Miami River. And so that's oil on canvas. Now, what Duncanson did is that he would code his stuff. Read about it in the book. I'm not going to go into that a lot. I think you should read. So read about every last one of these paintings had a little bit of a code in it. It may have looked like, to the average white viewer, like a beautiful landscape, and it is. It's a beautiful landscape. Excuse me, but he always had some other thing that was going on, because the first abolitionists were people of African descent. You might have been able to get deeper pockets from white abolitionists, but the first abolitionists were people of African descent. First those that were enslaved, and then those that were not, and then those who had simply escaped out. And so, but that was the way it worked. And then you had a few whites, it wasn't the overwhelming majority at all, a few whites who were willing to not only be verbal about their perspective, but also back it with dollars, or sometimes not be verbal at all because they didn't want to cause attention to themselves. They would just back it with their money, or meaning the white folks, because they had to survive in a culture that was very anti-Black. And so white people were policing other white people. This is the part that, again, gets written out of the history books. White people were policing each other around their acceptance of Blackness and their acceptance of feeling like Black people were fully human. That was always being a challenge. So maybe a white person did have these feelings, but maybe they weren't in Congress talking about all of these feelings that they had, but they would go ahead and build these safe houses, or safe panels in their homes, or provide shelter when people came through. But they never said anything to their neighbors about this because they still had to survive in the area where they were. Okay, so that would happen. And then Land of the Lotus Eaters, okay, and Oil on Canvas. And so this one, again, is coded. It is, again, a beautiful landscape. Looks like of the Southwest area, with plateaus and mountainous areas. It looks like we're looking at the long straight hair indigenous population. But Duncanson, again, is coding other messages in here. So read about that in your book. I am not going to ask you to know the actual date, but just know that it's from the 19th century, which is sometime in the 1800s. Again, 19th century, sometime in the 1800s. Okay, I'm not big on dates, but I am big on periods. And so just to understand the period that he's from, what's happening with him in order to produce the work that he's producing, what does it take for him to be able to go out, get work, support his family, and have to do it in a way where he still maintains a certain amount of clientele that he can continue to work. And also, he had to hide the codes. He couldn't just like put a Black person, you know, with the fist up and the chain broken. Not in America. He could not have during this particular period when slavery was sanctioned by every institution, education, the law, medical system, any institution that you looked at, it was being sanctioned. So he had to go code. And hence, you know, that gets into the Underground Railroad, which I will get into during another video, okay? And more than likely post that one onto Canvas. So I'll stop here and we'll start up with Patrick Reason next time. Okay.